Well, my name is Allan McMurray, and I am a past president of CBDNA and a longtime friend, student, and admirer of the person who we're going to be talking with today, and that's Robert Reynolds. Robert Reynolds is not only a past president of CBDNA, he's probably been, in my mind, one of the most influential members of our profession, not only from the standpoint of band directors, but just the developing artists in general. His commitment to excellence, his leadership in commissioning and in performance has been an inspiration to many. Those of us who were fortunate enough to be students of his have great memories of books and recordings and other things. And so this recording, hopefully, this interview will hopefully help everyone who didn't have an opportunity to study with Bob Reynolds to learn more about this man's influence on the profession and a little bit about what has made him who he is. So Bob, welcome.
Thank you. Well, you and I know, Alan, that we've known each other for over 50 years. And I count you as one of my closest and best friends.
And because of that, I will make sure that I only ask good questions. So let's start with the early days of you as a college conductor. You were hired at Cal State Long Beach, or Long Beach State College at the time. And maybe you could tell us about your early years as a young college conductor and what your first interaction and influences of CBDNA were.
Yeah, I'll just mention briefly that before I was hired at Long Beach State, I was hired at Long Beach State as the number 2 conductor. So I wasn't hired as director of bands, but the assistant. And that was a good thing for me, so I could learn. Prior to that, I was a high school band director at a large high school, Anaheim High School in Southern California. And then I was for 1 year at a very small school in Southern Michigan. So that's my lineage before I got to Long Beach. So my introduction to CBDNA was shortly after I became director of bands. I was at Long Beach State for a little over a year, and then the director of bands left to take an administrative position in Texas. More about him later, but then I took over, and one of the first things I did, I found out that there was a CBDNA convention in Tempe, Arizona, at Arizona State. So the person that I had hired, the number 2 person, Chuck Yates, and I got into a car and drove to Tempe, Arizona to CBDNA. And lo and behold, it was a fantastic convention. I had no idea. It was one of the best conventions I've ever gone to of CBDNA ever since. I mean, Aaron Copland Emblems was premiered there. And then Gunther Schuller was there. Ingolf Dahl was there conducting the Sinfonietta and gave a lecture on the Sinfonietta. And Keith Wilson was there. He may have been president at that point. I'm not sure, but he was a major force at that convention. I should mention also that everybody was really eager to hear Emblems. Copland didn't conduct it. It was rehearsed and conducted by William Schaefer, who was the conductor at USC at the time. So they did the first performance, and then they performed it at Tempe, Arizona. But everybody was expecting a piece like Appalachian Spring or something that was user-friendly. And lo and behold, people got rather upset. There seemed to be divided into 2 areas. The area of people who were really upset about it because it didn't sound like Appalachian Spring, and the younger crowd, the 30-year-olds, like me and a number of others, who thought this was just the most fantastic thing ever. So it was really kind of divided into those 2. And now, fortunately, Emblems has taken its place in the major repertoire of our profession. So that was the other thing that happened at that convention is there was kind of a lineage of who was going to be the next president and who was going to be elected president. And there was an assumption, and people were, Jim Dunlap, who was a major figure, director of bands at Penn State. He was in line to be president. Well, what happened when we all showed up in the western part of the United States, is all the conductors from the western part of the United States outnumbered everybody else. And so we thought that we don't know much about Jim Dunlap, but the guy we really want to have in there is Jim Jorgensen, who was director of bands at Redlands University. So he was elected by mistake, in a sense, because not by mistake, but he wasn't expected to be elected. But that's how Jim Jorgensen came to be president of CBDNA. So that's my first connection with CBDNA. It was very dramatic to me and very positive. I thought, this is an organization I want to be a part of.
Now, shortly thereafter at Long Beach, you had Aaron Copland out to your campus, and you also had Mio too. Was that really inspired by that conference in Arizona?
I wish I could say yes, but the answer is no. It turns out that Aaron Copland was a good friend of the orchestra conductor at Long Beach State, whose name was Henry Timianka, a famous violinist and conducted the orchestra. And so Copland came out to Long Beach State, and I've got photographs of his conducting the Long Beach State, my ensemble at Long Beach State. And there were so many people who wanted to witness that we couldn't hold it in the rehearsal room. There wasn't enough room, so we held it outside in the patio of the school. And there's a picture of me sitting on the ground so I could turn pages for Aaron Copland so the score wouldn't fly off because of the wind. Anyway, there was a Copland concert, and Emblems was on it. And he said one thing to me that has remained with me ever since. And that is that there was a point in the piece, and I can't remember exactly where it was, and there was a tempo marking, but I felt it should go a little bit slower than the tempo marking. But I wanted him to know that I knew what the tempo marking was. So at that point, I turned around to him and I said, I know I'm going a little bit slower on this, but if you want me to go at the exact tempo marking, I'm happy to do that. And he said, if I were conducting it, I'd go at the speed that it was marked. But I don't want you to go at the speed that's marked. I want you to go at the speed that you feel the piece should be done. Big lesson. So that's how Copland came to Long Beach State.
So that conference that you attended in Tempe was in 1964, and you were still living in Long Beach. And what were some of the most profound early influences on you while you were at Long Beach, or before?
Well, a few people. Probably the biggest influence on me, well, it's hard to say because they all had major influences, but the one I want to mention first is my college conducting teacher, Elizabeth Green. I learned so much from her. She was the greatest teacher of anything I ever had in my life. And she could do everything she was asking you to do. I don't want to go into all the details, but she would ask us to conduct a 4/4 pattern within 1 inch. And then she would say, now let's do it with a 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch. And she could do it. And she would have exercises that we would get up in front, how to cut off and how to start and all the cues and all the things you know how to do. She taught us the grammar of conducting. My most memorable time with her was, I don't need to go into all this, but I had my high school band director help me with conducting before I went to college. And so I could do a lot of the stuff that others in the class couldn't do just because I had a high school band director who helped me. And so I didn't have to work as hard. So I did one of these exercises and I hadn't worked on it, but I could do it. I just got up and did it. I thought I did fine. And she looked at me and said, Robert, I know what you're capable of, and don't ever stand up here prepared like that again. And I haven't. So the other influence, of course, I played in Ravelli's band at the University of Michigan, and he was a big influence. The band played great. They were just filled with wonderful musicians. When I came to Michigan, I came from Pennsylvania, and I was a hotshot in Pennsylvania, first chair horn and all the stuff and so on. But when I came to Michigan, I auditioned and I was last chair. I couldn't believe I was last chair until I heard the people warming up in the rehearsal. And everybody in front of me was better than I was. So it was a great lesson on what the sounds were of that band and how he balanced the band. I mean, there's all kinds of stories about that. And I was sort of in the middle. There was half the group with Ravelli, and of course, Ravelli was the person who started CBDNA. He collected everybody together and started the organization. And he was a very commanding figure on the podium, even though he was short, like Fennell was short. They're both commanding figures on the podium. And members like me would fall into one of two categories. Either everything he said, we were just going to follow. That's the way to do it. And the other half of the group, nothing he said. They hated everything he did. And I couldn't understand either one of them, because my feeling was, I'll just take the best things he has to offer and not the other things. But I seem to be alone in that sort of concept of accept the better things he had to offer. He had a lot to offer. He was, of course, from the old maestro school. I mean, he referred to Toscanini a lot. And that was the day of Toscanini and Fritz Reiner and George Zell and the heavy-handed maestro. And he was one of those. But he could produce. He produced great ensembles all the time. And not just because he had great players. He knew how to put it together. Anyway, the other person who influenced me a lot was Fred Fennell. I had a really wonderful experience with Fred when the very first honor band I ever conducted. I was new director of bands at Long Beach State. I was like, 31 or 2 or some young age. And I was asked to do the All Southern California High School honor band. And the way it worked was they were hiring Fred Fennell to do half the concert, and I would do half the concert. And so I prepared everything, though, because we used to rehearse every Sunday afternoon for several times. And then I prepared his music and my music, so when he came in, he could just put the finishing touches that he would do. Well, truth be told, I think I prepared his music more diligently than I prepared my own. I had this vision in my mind that he was going to stand on the podium and say, everything is just the way I want it. There's nothing more I can do. Because when he got ready to conduct the first rehearsal, his music was already at performance level. And what actually happened, he got on the podium and just took that performance level rehearsals that I had done and just took off. And the music just soared. It was a great lesson for me. It was very different from Elizabeth Green, but very influential. That turned me on my ear, watching him in those early rehearsals with the group that I had rehearsed so diligently. The other person that you remember as well as I do, who influenced me greatly in all kinds of ways, was John Green. John Green was director of bands at Long Beach State, and he's the one who hired me to be his assistant. And he and I were there together for a year and a half before he took an administrative position at a Texas university. And he taught me how to retire. He also taught me how to treat an assistant. He and I were colleagues. I would do anything he asked me to do because he provided such a great example for how to do it. I remember, I could go on and on about John Green, but in the fall, when we would get the marching band together or the concert band together, he would come into the first rehearsal because he'd met everybody in the course of the time when he recruited them and met them when they auditioned and so forth. So he came into the first rehearsal of the ensemble and went through every member of that ensemble who was new to the ensemble and said, this is so-and-so, and he's from Palmdale, California. Said who they were and where they were from. It was a virtuoso performance by him. And he was equally good at music, and he was equally good at administration. But his best attributes were how he treated people. one of the students who was there was not much younger than I was. I was in very early, maybe 30, 31 at that time. I came to Long Beach State at 29. And so there was a person there by the name of Leo Potts, who was a saxophone player and an excellent, well, you know Leo, was an excellent player and an excellent person. Leo and I are still very close friends. Now, you have to understand that Leo was a student and I was on the faculty. But Leo and I would have conversations in the hallway and after about all kinds about music and life and et cetera, because we could relate to each other. And one time he said to me, this student said to me, the faculty member, I think you should take conducting lessons. Well, fortunately, knowing Leo, I didn't take it wrong because I easily taken that wrong. So my response to him was, who would I take lessons from? His response was, well, Zubin Mehta is music director of the LA Philharmonic, take from him. So, and this started my time as a person just going for it. So I wrote, this is before emails and texting and all that kind of stuff. I wrote him a letter. This is when you could write letters. And I wrote a letter to Zubin Mehta in a sense saying, I want to take conducting lessons from you. Well, I got a letter back from the third level assistant to the administrator saying, Mr. Mehta does not give conducting lessons. Well, not to be deterred. And that has been a motive in my life, not to be deterred. I said, well, can I come to a rehearsal? Okay, they let me come to a rehearsal. Well, then can I come to another rehearsal? And they let me come to another rehearsal. And can I come to another? And then finally they said, okay, you can come to any rehearsal as long as you let us know ahead of time. So if there's some reason that's not appropriate, we'll let you know. So I went to all these rehearsals at LA Philharmonic because as you remember, the Long Beach State group rehearsed like Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So I had these Tuesday, Thursday things open. So I went not every week, but nearly every week, once a week to his rehearsals. And then I noticed that the players in the ensemble had these little booklets, which indicated, I found out they indicated what pieces were going to be rehearsed at that rehearsal. So I said, can I have one of those? So they sent me one of those. So I went to the future rehearsals with scores of the pieces they were rehearsing. So it turns out I studied conducting with Zubin Mehta, except Zubin Mehta doesn't know it. I've got a list here. It's gotten a little crazy. Because these are people, and I've got them in alphabetical order. These are people who I have witnessed in rehearsal. Marian Alsop, Blumstead, Boulez, Chailly, Dudamel, Fiedler. I actually played in an orchestra that Fiedler conducted. Gergiev, Giulini, Giancarlo Guerrero, Malky, Zubin Mehta again, Andres Nelsons, I've seen many times, as well as Eugene Ormandy, Simon Rattle, Asa Pekka Salonen, Gunther Schuller, Robert Shaw, Leonard Slatkin, Vakhtangny, and Zinman. And the other person I saw conduct, but I didn't see him rehearse. My mother took me to a concert when I was a teenager, before I went to college, in Cleveland, because she thought that I would enjoy the concert and she would too. So we saw a concert of the NBC Symphony conducted by Toscanini. That orchestra could play. Man, oh man. Anyway.
Well, let me just follow up, Bob, for a second with a question, because I think this is, I didn't have this written down and we haven't talked about it, but
right.
All these conductors who you listed who have had influence on you are all orchestral conductors, and for years I've been looking at that too. What do you think is the advantage of watching an orchestral conductor working with a professional ensemble for us as wind conductors?
Well, it doesn't matter. I also watched Robert Fountain conduct choirs. Robert Shaw called Robert Fountain the finest choral conductor in the country, including himself. Robert Fountain and I were on the same faculty together at Wisconsin. So I don't think it matters what the person is conducting, because what every conductor is conducting, they're conducting people who are making music, and that's the common area. And when people say, what's the difference between conducting an orchestra and conducting a band, in my estimation, the only difference is repertoire. I don't see, I mean, I learned so much from watching the best conduct and rehearse. I mean, it'd be like if being a horn player like myself or a trumpet player like you, if you could sit next to the great trumpet players or the great horn players of the world, wouldn't you learn a great deal? And that's what, and I still do that. In my post-retirement job at USC, I went to a whole lot of rehearsals with the LA Philharmonic. I enjoy them and I learn so much from them. And it's difficult to pinpoint what you learn because you take it in as an atmosphere, as a way of dealing with people. It's not something you can outline and make objective comments about.
Yeah, but the thing that I always valued in you is you were more interested in being observant than being observed, and and in that we're really interested in learning from others. So I think that's been an important quality that you've revealed to your students just through your dedication to this for as long as I've known you. But let's get back to CBDNA for a second.
Okay.
You went, before you left Long Beach, because you went from Long Beach to Wisconsin, from Wisconsin to Michigan. But before you left Long Beach, you took that band to a national convention of CBDNA. That was probably the first national convention you ever played at in your life, Bob.
Exactly.
What do you remember about that convention? What was it about going there that was important, and just anything about that experience?
Well, that convention was in Provo, Utah. So we took off, and you know as well as I do because you were in the group. We took off and went to Las Vegas and played a concert in Las Vegas, and then took off and went to Provo and played a concert in the evening. And I remember two things vividly about that concert. And I don't remember much about the repertoire. You may remember more about it than I do. The two pieces that I remember the most are Lincolnshire Posy we played, and we played the Hindemith concert music, Opus 41. And the one thing I remember, which is personal to you, is you were really sick during that time and still played great. And the concert music Opus 41 it's almost like a stand-up trumpet solo part. It's like for solo trumpet and solo trombone and everybody else. And you played great. In fact, you were so sick that when we went back to Long Beach, we went by Flagstaff, Arizona, and we had to leave you in the hospital there. The other thing I remember is that Ravelli, my college conductor, came up to me after the concert and said to me, "That was very orchestral." And I thought to myself at the time, I still remember this, okay, so you didn't like it. And you were nice enough to me not to tell me that directly. But what I found out later is that he went back to Ann Arbor and told the Michigan Symphony Band, which was, of course, way better than our Long Beach group, how he heard this great group from Long Beach and they could really play the Michigan Symphony Band under the table and so on, which of course was all baloney, but he was just trying to motivate them, I think. And then later, I found out from the chairman of the music department, Dale Gilbert at Wisconsin, because he called Ravelli and said, we're going to have a director of bands opening at Wisconsin. Do you have anybody you can recommend? And Ravelli recommended me. So
that's a great transition into going to Wisconsin. So at Wisconsin, I mean, there were a number of things. I'd like for you to talk about your recollections of your involvement in and promoting of the development of the Wind Ensemble, the concept of Wind Ensemble. Maybe you could talk about the repertoire, the Wind Ensemble conferences, that aspect of time in your career.
Well, that all started at Long Beach, because you may remember, when I first went to Long Beach, I was conducting the second band, and that band was not very capable, and the instrumentation was very spotty and so forth. And so I wanted something really good to conduct, so I started a brass ensemble, and the brass ensemble was quite good. It had really good players, some standout players in it, and so that got me going with that area. And also, when I was at Long Beach State as director of bands, we did the Hindemith Symphony on a concert, and I noticed on the back of the score, of the published score, there was another piece by Hindemith that said, "Music for Blas Orchestra, Opus 41." I had never heard of it. Nobody ever said anything about it to me. I didn't know what it was. And so I just, here's my theme again, I'm not to be deterred, I just ordered it. I thought, well, let's try it. Because if the symphony is really good, this has a chance of being really good too. So that started because that has a reduced instrumentation and so on. So that started the whole thing. And then I started to do at Wisconsin, more of the serenade kind of things, the symphonies of wind instruments and Mozart serenades and so forth. And that began the whole thing. In an earlier conversation you and I had, I don't know that anything, and you can bear this out or not, I don't know that anything like the Hindemith Opus 41 was played very much at CBDNA conventions. It was a big band kind of situation.
Yeah.
And so,
as far as I know, Bob, that was one of the first times that an other than full band piece had been performed. I mean, there may be dissertation projects that dispel that, but as far as I know, that performance that you did with Long Beach Group was groundbreaking. We'll call it groundbreaking.
yes.
So, but the wind ensemble, the idea of other than full band instrumentation was not embraced a lot at CBDNA conventions. In fact, it was difficult to get them performed. So there was this group that was formed that you were part of outside of CBDNA to try to promote this repertoire. Tell us about that.
Just prior to that, when I was at Wisconsin, a group of students came to me and said, we've gotten everybody together to do the Schoenberg Chamber Symphony, but we need a conductor. Would you be willing to conduct it? Well, I'd never conducted it. I didn't even know it. But if all these good players were playing it, then I wanted to be a part of it. And so I studied like crazy and conducted it, and it came off really well. And I enjoyed that so much that we put together a similar group with the wind ensemble and did the Berg Chamber Concerto for winds plus solo violin and solo piano. And again, it's only like 13 or 14 players. So that again started that whole process of being interested. The real motivation behind that, and I think the Wind Ensemble Conference and so forth, was that we wanted to gather to the profession, to the wind ensemble band profession, the best possible repertoire. And we didn't want to be limited by the instrumentation. And this was at a time with CBDNA and ABA and a number of other places that they were really talking about standardized band instrumentation, with the theory that the orchestra has a standard instrumentation. Why shouldn't the band have a standard instrumentation? How many clarinets should there be? How many trumpets? How many cornets? How many alto clarinets? How many French horns? And so forth. So there was all this discussion. People on one side were talking about that. People on the other side were saying, no, we let the composer decide what instrumentation is. So there was a not battle, but there was a strong disagreement with the two camps. And I'm sure you can guess which camp I was in on that. And then,
I know which camp you were in.
Well, and then during that time, a bunch of us got kind of dissatisfied with CBDNA and the direction, because it was seen to be mostly in two directions. One was marching band, athletic band, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. It just seemed like that there was an enormous amount of energy going to that, and another equally amount of energy going to small college groups with limited instrumentation. So that was, and a bunch of us felt that there's nothing in this to attract our attention for what we want. There's everything right with what that is, but there was too much of that. There wasn't a balance of CBDNA with that. So there was a group called the Wind Ensemble Conference. It was never, didn't have officers or anything. We just showed up and did it. First one was at New England Conservatory with Frank Battisti, and then I want to say Northern Illinois, where Larry Livingston was, and then Cal State Northridge, where Dave Whitwell was. And then I'm a little at sea about what came next, but it could have been South Florida or University of Illinois, and then finally University of Wisconsin, which I hosted. I still have a picture on my wall here with 5 of us standing outside the concert hall, Frank Battisti, John Pater, Don Hunsberger, myself, and Fred Fennell. Mm-hmm. And at that performance, then it was shortly after we'd done a performance of that Baroque Chamber Concerto. So I did a performance plus an analysis for the membership that were there, because those were the kind of things we were missing at CBDNA. And then later on, CBDNA began to embrace those kinds of things. So it became unnecessary for the Wind Ensemble Conference to even exist, because CBDNA was embracing not only the marching band small college thing, but the advanced repertoire.
But you also stimulated more interest in alternative instrumentations by the fact that you had your graduate students put together this wind ensemble repertoire guide, because there was no place other than the back of a score to find out if there was a piece written by a composer that might be for wind. So you had us do that, but what prompted you to have us do that?
Well, it was prompted because we were hosting the Wind Ensemble Conference. And I thought, well, let's just publish, available for the people who come to the conference, a list of non-band music. And I thought it would be like a couple pages. And so we got going on this. But I had at that point, not only you, but Bob Grachewski and Stan DeRusha. I don't remember who else now.
Later, Eugene Corcoran, yeah. Yeah, after we did the initial one, and then Eugene added to it and made it better afterwards.
Yeah, and more to it, and a better publication. So it became a resource for people who didn't know enough about the wind chamber music, wind chamber music kind of thing.
So part of that whole thing, and part of your interest was new music. You enjoyed working with new music, but you were also interested in commissioning composers. Could you talk a little bit about commissioning? And at that same time, by the way, I'm going to kind of integrate this together, because you were during the time you were at Wisconsin. I think was it then that you were elected the divisional president of the North Central Division while you were still at Wisconsin? Or was that after you became at Michigan? Oh
no, it was before Michigan.
Okay, so you were still at Wisconsin, and you were elected divisional president, so you started serving on the board. Tell us about your involvement and your interest in commissions.
Well, it started, I think this was at a national CBDNA convention, and there was a discussion that turned into a commission, a CBDNA commission. I think the very first one was given to Henk Baddings, a Dutch composer. And there was a lot of discussion about whether, again, there was 2 camps on this. There was one group, that I was part of, that thought, yes, anything we can do to encourage the composer to write music and commissions, we can help that. And the other half was, the composer should just write the music and they'll get the money when it's played by people. So if it's a worthy piece, a lot of people will play it, they'll get the funds there, but there's no really need to commission. And so this thing went back and forth, and then it started. And that, of course, one commission after another, and then finally, people couldn't, small schools couldn't afford, they wanted to be part of the commission, but commissions were, like at that point seemed like a lot of money, like between $5,000 and $10,000. But that was a lot of money in the dark ages when that happened. So a consortium started happening. So, I talked to my friend Allan, talked to my friend Craig, and so forth. If we each put in $300. Can we get so and so to do it? Or you ask so and so to do it, and how much will it cost? And then you get your friends together, and that's blown up in the best possible way, because now CBDNA doesn't need to commission pieces anymore, because it's all handled by the membership in the organization or conductors everywhere. And it happens considerably more, the consortium considerably more than orchestras do it. Orchestras will commission themselves to commission one composer. But there are a lot of consortiums with the band conductors, and that's the way it started.
So I remember an interesting story that you told me one time about your interaction with Ernst Krenek and trying to help him know what it was going to be to write for Winds. Could you just share a little bit of that experience?
Well, Dave Whitwell was president of CBDNA at that point. And Dave Whitwell, I've known him longer than I've known you, actually. Dave Whitwell and I, plus two other horn players, shared the top floor of a building when we were students at Michigan. Anyway, Dave Whitwell was president of CBDNA, and he felt we should commission Ernst Krenek to write a piece for Winds. And so he said, Reynolds, I want you to be in charge of that. So I pulled up a bunch of scores, because Krenek was more of a 12-tone kind of composer, not completely 12-tone, but that influence. So I got scores of Schoenberg and Gunther Schuller, all Wind Ensemble concert band kind of pieces, and took them with me and showed up, made an appointment, of course, showed up at his house in Palm Springs, California, with Fred Fennell again, and Gene Corporon, and a good friend of ours, Bill Nichols. So the four of us showed up there and talked to him about doing this commission, and he was agreeable to doing that. And I told him at that point, and his wife was there, I said, I have recordings. I didn't bring them with me, but I have recordings of all these pieces that I'm going to loan you the scores to. If you want me to send you the recordings, I'm certainly happy to do that. And his wife said to me, that won't be necessary. Ernst can read a score. So that put me in my place.
When was the time that you remember when this Wind Ensemble conference and these separate things kind of merged back to CBDNA, and there was no need to meet separately, and everything was moving forward with CBDNA incorporating all of the things that you valued?
I think it was shortly after the Wisconsin Wind Ensemble conference, because I think that Wisconsin one was the last one. And then the bunch of us were talking there and feeling that CBDNA was expanding into the realm of the most serious and advanced music. So we didn't feel there was a need to do it, that we could combine our energies into CBDNA and continue that focus. Wind Ensemble Conference only started because there was a lack of that sort of musical energy within CBDNA.
And it was interesting, there were only about 30 of us that went from place to place to do those things. It's a small number of people.
Right. But we knew what we were going to get. We were going to get the best possible performances and in-depth discussions about really important repertoire.
So you go to Michigan, your alma mater as director of bands, and you become president of CBDNA. But there are a lot of things going on. There are things going on here in Michigan. There are things going on. You're president of CBDNA. Obviously, Michigan became a really important platform for you to influence the profession. It had been the home of Bill Ravelli, who had been the founder of CBDNA, and now you're there as president. What were some of your goals for CBDNA as you became president, and how do you feel those came about, or what happened?
There was some difficulty I had at the time I was president, and nobody was doing anything. There was no controversies or anything, except while I was president, 1983 to 85. In 1984, right in the middle, the Michigan Symphony Band went to Europe for 6 weeks. and played a premiere of an opera by Stockhausen at La Scala Opera. Now that was a major project, and that took up an enormous amount of time, energy, and effort on my part. So maybe I wasn't tuned into CBDNA constantly during that time. Mm-hmm. So there's some, not regret, but if those things hadn't been combined into that period, that 2-year period, I think I would have been different. If there is a lifetime goal for me with the profession, is to pull the band and wind ensemble profession into the mainstream of serious concert music. And that has been an ongoing effort on my part. So consequently, when I was president and had the office and so forth, all the influence was on that. What kind of composers were we commissioning? We also did conducting workshops. We started a conducting workshop when I was at Wisconsin, but then they began to expand. I mean, you and I collaborated on several of those at the University of Colorado, and they were CBDNA workshops. And then as the commissioning thing expanded, it became unnecessary to have CBDNA commission pieces because everybody was doing it. And now it's become unnecessary for CBDNA to sponsor conducting workshops because everybody is doing it. It's the way it should happen. We start something and it grows, and then we kind of give it over to the people who are actually doing it.
Was a time while you were serving on the board for CBDNA that the Frank Battisti initiated that international conference for symphonic bands and ensembles?
Yeah, that was before I was president. It was when Frank was president and I was on the board at that time. Okay. Then it was a time when WASB was just beginning to emerge, and Frank was a big force in that. And he was convincing CBDNA that we should lend our influence and resources to help that organization give birth. Mm-hmm. It did, and that's still going. And now again, it's another example of CBDNA doesn't have to do that with WASB anymore because it's grown outside that.
Well, while you may feel that you were that you didn't do as much as you wanted to as president of CBDNA, you and I collaborated on a convention, and I thought you had a lot of influence on that. and it also carried through on what you just described, Bob, the idea of bringing in the highest level of artistry. Could you talk a little bit about, and maybe you can talk about what we brought into that conference and how that was important to the profession?
So we had a premier ensemble. So if you were to have, if those of you who are out there listening to this, if you were to have a CBDNA convention, either as the host or the president, who would you want to have as the premier ensemble performing at that convention? Well, what we had was the Netherlands Wind Ensemble, the old Netherlands Wind Ensemble performing and rehearsing. They actually rehearsed in front of everybody at that convention. I mean, it was fantastic. And the way that happened was when I was at Wisconsin, and you were there too, the Netherlands Wind Ensemble came to play at the University of Wisconsin as part of the university concert series that so many universities have. And so we were thrilled. And so we went to the concert and were thrilled at the concert. And then we invited those players in the Netherlands Wind Ensemble. There was probably, a dozen players in there or less. 10 to a dozen. We invited them to come out with us afterwards to a place called the Brathaus, which is like not a fancy place, but you get beer and brats and so forth. So they came out and got that. And then because the United States owned, and they played at that concert, the Grand Partita of Mozart. Mm-hmm. And because we all own, as citizens of the United States, we own the original manuscript of the Grand Partita. It's in the Library of Congress. And they have microfilms of that. So I got microfilms of it and then produced a couple of scores, one for myself and one to give to them. And then there was, when I showed it to them, then there was all this excitement at the table at the Brathaus with players saying, see, I told you that was the way it was. No, you see that? No, that's the way it should be. This and no, and there was all this discussion. So we became, compatriots. So then I visited Amsterdam a few times for other reasons and became quite well acquainted with the principal oboe player, Werner Herbers, and through him, invited them to come to Colorado for the conference.
Mhm.
The conference was worth going to just to hear them play and rehearse. One of the things they did was rehearse a piece that they hadn't rehearsed before, a brand new piece for their repertoire.
Mhm.
And that was very educational to everybody to see
Yeah.
how they rehearsed. And it was with the idea that somebody said, well, I think this is a little too fast. So I said, no, I don't think it's so fast. And so they would try it. So they would try it both ways. And then they would have a discussion about what was right and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was very educational.
With that artistry and with the influence you've had on the commissioning and the work you've done with symposia, tell me about, you've taught conducting and mentored conductors for decades. Could you tell us some about that and what your memories and what you're proud of in that?
I'm very proud of the students I've had. Again, I've got a list. And I really want to read the list because it's spectacular. Well, first, let me say, as a proud, parental figure of former students, some former students are the current president of CBDNA, Mark Speed, the person who will be president after him, Glenn Adsett, the person who will be president after him, Mike Voda. All those were my students, and I'm very proud of that. So anyway, so here's the list of students that I've had. Glenn Adsett, as I mentioned, Gene Corporon, a guy that's probably a lot of you don't know, but who does fantastic things. Damian Crutcher does fantastic things with minority community in Detroit. Kevin Giraldi, Dennis Glocke, Stan DeRusha, Jeff Grogan, Jerry Junkin, Tim McAllister. Tim McAllister is unusual because he's a really great solo saxophone player. Teaches saxophone at Michigan. He was a concerto. He played a concerto. See how good he is. He played a concerto with the Berlin Philharmonic. But he took a conducting degree too. And then there's this guy, Allan McMurray, Jamie Nix, Bob Ponto, Larry Ratcliffe, Stuart Sims, Gary Speck, Scott Teeple, Bill Weidrich, Eric Wilson, and Peter Whitty. So all those people, somebody asked me, I was doing a conducting workshop at an evening table. There's one of these big round tables where there are probably a dozen people sitting around having dinner together. And some guy packed up and said, you're known as a really good conducting teacher. What's your secret? I said, well, my secret is only accept the best and most talented students. Let them conduct and then talk about it a little bit. And when they go out and they're wildly successful, I take full credit for teaching them. But there was one ingredient that I always look for in a student. And if a student didn't have that, I couldn't admit them because I couldn't teach it. I could teach them all the techniques and repertoire and all kinds of other things, but I couldn't teach this. And that was the ability to project their own inner musicianship and inner music onto the ensemble. If they had that, they could have some limitations and I would still accept them. But if they didn't have that, I couldn't. So anyway, I've had this enormous love affair with my students. I'm in retirement. That is the one thing I miss the most, the contact with the students.
And I would say as a former student, as long as we're talking about your students, that there's never a time where I felt that I couldn't call you or call upon you for advice or counsel or just to run something by you, that your commitment to your students extends beyond the time that they get their degree and go out into the profession, that you continue mentoring and still continue mentoring your students. And I'm sure they would all agree with me on that.
Well, what's turned out is that all these students who are now famous conductors, we've become close friends. It's gone way beyond student teacher. That's not even part of it anymore. It's friend to friend. I mean, early on, you know, when a person was a new grad student or something, it was teacher student, but then it progressed past that because of the way they treated me and I treated them.
Yeah, but you were open to that with Leo Potts. I mean, it started early in your career, Bob, to actually form meaningful artistic relationships with those people who you found interesting and provocative and curious. I mean, that's not something that just happened recently. That's been around for a long time for you, I think.
Yeah, it's just the way I am.
It's okay. You can be that way. How have you tried to, and we've talked a little bit about this, but how have you tried to encourage artistry in college and Wind programs? I mean, when, and I'm going to throw a couple of things out that I'd like for you to talk about. One is I think that the search committees call you a lot. And they ask you about people, and they may be people that have been former students, or they may be people that you worked with at a symposium, or they may be people that you just know. But you have an influence, and I think that search committees know they can call you because you're going to be honest with them, and you're going to highlight those things that you think are the greatest accomplishments of those people. But because of that, you've had a real influence on the profession, and you've encouraged artistic growth in colleges and universities. How have you tried to do that, and what are the ways that you've tried to do that, and have you been successful at it?
Well, you're not going to like my answer. I don't know that I've tried to do it. It's just what I do. I didn't try. It's just somebody calls me and asks me for my honest opinion, I will give it to them. But what I do with people who are asking me about, particularly former students, I will give them my answer to what they have as their major positive points. If I think a person is not at his best doing something, I will probably not mention it. But if I think a person has a good sense of humor, is highly enthusiastic, who really has a commanding presence on the podium, then I'm going to mention all those things. Because I don't want something I'm going to say to be the death knell of that person getting the job. It's okay if somebody else gets a job because they more specifically fit the mold that school wants, but it's not because I wasn't. And I feel positive about all these people. There's not one of those people on that list that I don't feel positive about.
You went from Michigan, and then even though you retired from Michigan, you found opportunities to, I don't know, was it post-retirement or was it a renaissance of a career? I'm not sure how to categorize it, but the work at USC and the work at Tanglewood, I think, are really important to talk a little bit about too. And maybe you could talk about that point in your life and your career, and what you feel that you brought to that, and why that was important to you.
Well, the USC thing happened by accident. Well, not really by accident, but the dean at USC I've known for a long time. That was Larry Livingston. And I had already announced my retirement from Michigan. And he called me and said, I understand you're retiring. This will be your last year at Michigan. I said, yes. And he said, well, we've lost our wind ensemble conductor at USC. He's going to become the dean at Cincinnati Conservatory. And so he said, and I'm only going to be dean for one more year. And I don't want to make a decision of who the next wind ensemble conductor is. I think the next dean should be able to do that. So would you be willing to come out here and do this job for a year? I said, I'd love it if with some conditions, that there's no paperwork, there are no auditions, or grades or recruiting. If it's all music, I'm in. And so that's what it was. They couldn't find a dean. So he stayed on as dean for the next year. So I stayed on as the Wind Ensemble for the next year. Then they did get a dean, who's still a dean. And he said to me that we had a meeting. He said, well, everybody says this is really working really well. Because I had this colleague there by the name of Sharon Lavery, who managed everything, who did all the paperwork, auditions, grades, et cetera, et cetera. And so the new dean said, I understand this is working. Why do we want to stop this? So I finally stopped this when COVID started this last year. Almost 20 years in that 1-year job. And the same thing happened when, it's been over 15 years ago, I got a call from the head of the Boston University Tanglewood and said, we'd like you to come and conduct our Wind Ensemble this summer. And it's a bunch of high school students, but those high school students can play anything. I mean, they are top of the line students with a faculty that goes along that coaches them, and et cetera, et cetera. And that has given me, with that credential, I can go to any Boston Symphony rehearsal I want to go to. That's what happened. So I'm the luckiest guy in the world to have those two, because I was able to keep doing it without being weighed down, because at Michigan, as director of bands, there were 2 other band conductors, plus a secretary, plus 3 concert groups, plus 2 non-music major groups, plus the marching band and other athletic bands. I mean, it was an enormous non-musical aspect of what I was doing. And I just couldn't keep doing it. Mm-hmm. So when the musical things started popping up, then I did that. The other thing that really influenced me a lot on my own conducting, and we don't need to go into this, was I was conductor of a group called the Detroit Chamber Winds and Strings for over 35 years. And nearly every member of that group was a member of the Detroit Symphony. So conducting really high level players and their expectations of that helped me.
I think it's an interesting historical anomaly that you were at USC and conducted at that concert in Arizona. That was your last concert at USC, wasn't it, that you conducted?
Or was there one more concert, but that was the last major concert.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that? And because that was your most recent CBDNA conducting performance, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, because of the first conference I went to of CBDNA in Tempe, Arizona State, and this was in Tempe, Arizona State, and that first conference had such a big impact on me, I felt that like a reprise, not an exact reprise, but a salute to that first concert that affected me so greatly. So we did the Dahl Sinfonietta.
Once again, with the same ensemble.
What?
The same school's ensemble.
Yeah. USC went there to perform the Dahl Sinfonietta, and Gunther Schuller was there, so we did a Gunther Schuller piece to end the concert. And they had a composer there at the first concert, so I wanted to bring a composer who's a close friend, Frank DeKelly, who conducted on the concert. It was all...
And emblems.
Oh, yeah. How could I forget emblems? There is one thing about emblems that I do want to say, just because I'm so proud of it, and I hope this doesn't come off wrong.
If it does, we'll edit it out.
Because I don't. I try not to brag about this, but what the difference between bragging and being proud of something. We did emblems also at Michigan. Very early, in 1977, shortly after I went to Michigan. And this was before CDs and technical, the internet and so forth. So we made a tape of the performance, as we did all the performances. And I sent a tape of that to Copeland. And as it happened, one time I was sitting at my desk opening the mail, and there was a letter from Aaron Copeland in my mail. So I opened it up, and this is what I found. So it's a short letter. but I really want to read it. From Aaron Coppola. Dear Mr. Reynolds, I have just listened to the tape performance of my emblems as played by the Symphony Band of the University of Michigan. I hasten to send you and the members of the band my appreciation for their brilliant performance of a difficult work. The best performance I have ever heard of the emblems, not excluding those I have myself conducted. It is a great pleasure for me as composer to have this permanent recorded version of emblems to add to my collection. Many thanks to all concerned. Yours sincerely, Aaron Coppola. I was reading from this, but I've got the real copy framed on my wall. I mean, it's one of the finest things that ever happened to me.
Yeah.
Getting a letter.
And it was wonderful of him to take the time to write the letter to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, he was quite a humble person in all his fame and glory.
So those collaborations were all great, but we talked before about things that I guess advice you could give to young conductors, but also missed opportunities, things that, you know.
Well, yeah, there are some opportunities. I would like to go back and relive some years of my life so I could take advantage of some of the things I just didn't take advantage of. Fortunately, I took advantage of that comment by Leo Potts that I should study conducting, because that influenced me enormously. But just before I went to California and got the Anaheim High School job. But before that, there was summer, and I needed some employment because I was out of money. And they had this opening in the Long Beach Municipal Band, which is a civil service group that played concerts in parks around the city of Long Beach. And in that band were a number of people. Well, when was it? 1958. So that was a long time ago. There were a number of people in that band who had played in Sousa's band as members of Sousa's band. And I didn't have the smarts or the perception to sit down and talk to those guys about what it was like to be part of that. I mean, I just missed that whole thing. I could have learned so much, and both historically and musically, about what it was like to play with Sousa and that band. And that's one. And then while I was at Anaheim High School, excuse me, I felt I needed a doctorate. So I started a doctoral degree at USC in horn performance, because the conducting degree, they expected advanced piano. And that was not part of my ability, shall we say. So I started into horn performance. And the horn teacher there was Jim Decker, who played on, as a top call in the studios.
Didn't he do all the Mancini recordings?
He did that, and he played principal horn on all the Columbia Symphony recordings with Stravinsky and Bruno Walter. But I wasn't smart enough when I was studying horn with him to ask him, tell me about Bruno Walter and his conducting. Tell me about playing with Stravinsky. I just took horn lessons, and he and I got along great. And I visited him at his house. I took horn lessons at his house and visited him. He had a second home on the water. I went there too. And I asked him one time, because I said, why don't you audition and play in the LA Philharmonic? And he said, it doesn't pay enough. Because the studios paid a lot more. Yeah. And these recording sessions with these famous people paid a lot more. So I goofed. I should have done those things. And I hope the lesson is out there, that take advantage of all the opportunities you've got. Don't let them pass you by.
You're kind of still following through on that. We talked recently about something that you're collecting right now, or that you're working on, this project that you've got going. Maybe you could share that with us.
Well, after
Well,
I
this,
stopped,
it goes right along with what you were just talking about.
well, after I stopped conducting at USC this last year, just a year ago, after a couple of months, I got bored because I wasn't doing anything. And so I set about a couple projects for myself. And one of them, I can't do the second one because I need a collaborator, and it's difficult to get sit at the same table with somebody during this COVID thing. But the other one, I was going to find out, or try to find out, what the difference is between being a good conductor and a great conductor. So I decided I was going to ask a lot of people about that. And a lot of people responded to me. But early on, I decided I wasn't going to ask any conductors, because I didn't want to get a prejudiced viewpoint. So the people I asked were the high level performers in major symphony orchestras. And I've got like 20 people who've responded to me on email, all people I've known, a number of people who played with me at Michigan, but people from the Philadelphia Orchestra, the LA Philharmonic, the Pittsburgh Symphony, I mean, all over the place. One guy who played in the clarinet section of the New York Philharmonic, who's now principal clarinet of Houston Symphony. Got my former roommate, Howard, who played for nearly 40 years as principal horn of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. And there's
Well, the obvious follow-up question is, have you learned something from that that would change the way you conducted your next rehearsal and performance?
Yes and no. I learned from many of them that, and this is at the highest level now. This isn't conducting a junior high school band. This is at the highest level. That many of them said that spectacular baton technique is not really essential. What really is essential is depth of musicianship and understanding the design of the music and the goals of where the music is starting and where it transpires to goals and so on. The architecture of the music. The other thing that came out is how you treat players. You treat them with respect, because the days of the old maestros are gone, and rightfully so. So those are the things. I'm trying to put this together. I'm having difficulty doing that with in some kind of form. So I'm not the only one who has access to these 20 plus comments.
There's probably 200 doctoral students that would be at your beck and call if you wanted to get any help doing any of this.
Yeah, where were my former students when I need them?
Yeah, right. So what are your thoughts on CBDNA at present? I mean, do you think we're on the right track? I mean, this has been a difficult year and a half, but from the standpoint of what you see in the future and what you see going on in the present, where's CBDNA? How are we doing?
I think CBDNA now and has always been an active, future-looking organization. And I think this last year with the COVID thing has been an anomaly. And everybody should get down on their knees and thank Mark Speed for being president at this time, because he's done a spectacular job of being president and helping people guide through this time of how many people you can have in rehearsal and the research behind that and so on. But I do think that the future is so good because there are better people, better musicians, people with great knowledge in CBDNA who are ready to help. There's a real helpful spirit in CBDNA. It's not you don't go to a convention and hear a lot of people saying, well, I can do better than that. And I thought, did you hear that wrong? That you can hear that at other places, but you really don't hear that at CBDNA anymore. And that's a great, great thing. So there's this positive collaboration, all for the future. So I think CBDNA is in great, great shape. And I know with the leaders of the future, it's going to continue to be that way. I should tell you that Mike Voda, who was elected vice president at the last conference in Arizona, called me on the phone and he said, I'm beginning to think about the conference that I'm going to have in a few years. Do you have any suggestions? And my one suggestion to him was have somebody there to talk to the group about music making. Not band, not wind ensemble, just music making. And my suggestion for him was to try to hire a retired piano performance person by the name of Alfred Brendel, who's one of the great music interpreters of all time, to have him come and talk about making music. And it might not be for everybody. There might be people there that come and say, I just want to know how to build a better band. And that's okay, but that's not the end of it. That's not why we got into this. It's all well and good to have really good players and to have a better group, but making music is why we're here.
And one more thing, Bob, and this has to do with CBDNA, the Lifetime Achievement Award.
Yeah, that was one of the great things that happened to me. It's one of the 2 or 3 greatest things that have happened to me in the profession, was that I received the very first Lifetime Achievement Award from CBDNA, that my colleagues would think of me in that way. It's very, very important to me. There's a quote, and I can't remember exactly who said it now, that said, the quote was not by a musician. The only award that means a damn is one given by people who work at the same bench. And so all my friends who work at the same bench that I have gave me this fantastic gift of appreciation.
I just have to tell you that just talking to you reminds me of so many times where you guided me to a book of music and music making of Bruno Walter, or a recording. First time I heard the Netherlands Wind Ensemble, or a score, or score study, or Elizabeth Green's writings. I mean, all the things that have contributed to your growth, you shared so willingly and so eagerly and so immediately with your students. I just heard something, you've got to hear it. And that energy hasn't changed in you for all the time I've known you, Bob. And I've known you a long, long time. So
yeah, you have.
So, not only on behalf of me, but the profession, I just want to thank you, because you have had more influence on me than any other person in the profession. And I think there would be a chorus of people who would say the same thing. So, so the fact that you take the time to share what you believe and what you feel, and where your heart is, and where your passions are, that is very, very meaningful, and I hope will be meaningful for all the people that get to look at this in the future, because to study with you has been a great ride for me and a great joy, and I continue to do that. And one of the great things that you've done, Bob, also, is you've led by example. You're not a person who just says, you need to do this, but you say, I'm going to do it, and if you want to join me, that'd be a lot of fun. You've done that really, really well, led by example. So thanks.
Well, Alan, I appreciate your taking the time, energy, and effort to do this interview, because we've known each other a long time, and you know the truth.
And I didn't ask anything about that, Bob. No, but this is just one more in our list of collaborations, and I've taken great joy in it. So I want to thank CBDNA for giving us the opportunity to do this together. And I want to thank Joshua for setting up the Zoom, and for all of that. And unless there's something that you'd like to add to this as an amen, I've gotten all my questions done with.
Okay. Well, that's enough.
Okay.
We've talked enough. And I appreciate, the interaction again.
Yeah. It's always a pleasure, Bob.
Yeah.
And I'll see you soon, my friend.
Hopefully, yes. Absolutely.